So there is a really interesting thing happening right now. Donald Trump, well, this is not the interesting part, but he's been on Twitter going in on the idea of a spy. There was like a spy in his campaign. And he's, of course, melting down over this and calling it a political witch hunt. And then there are people on the Democratic side who are kind of mocking him because, you know, Trump, he always is fucking railing against something on Twitter. So it's a little bit the boy who cried wolf. If 9 out of 10 times you're ranting against something and you're just totally wrong, then the 10th time when there might actually be something there, people are still going to roll their eyes at you. So take a look at this from Glenn Greenwald at The Intercept. The FBI informant who monitored the Trump campaign, Stefan Halper, oversaw a CIA spying operation in the 1980 presidential election. So, right off the bat, what Trump was tweeting about is not exactly wrong. There was somebody who infiltrated his campaign. Now, the question is, when your campaign was infiltrated, was it after an official investigation had been launched based on evidence of some sort of wrongdoing? Because then that's fine, that's just normal police work. Or was it, no, they infiltrated your campaign before there was any reason to believe you're doing anything wrong? And if they did that, why would they do that? So, Stefan Halper infiltrated Trump's campaign. Now, Trump called him a spy, but the FBI basically fired back and said, no, you're wrong, and the media is wrong if they're implying he's a spy. He's an informant. Okay, we're parsing words here. That's a little strange. But what else is strange is that the New York Times and the Washington Post refused to name this spy, this informant, whatever you want to call him. They refused to name him, and they're citing these vague national security concerns. But what they did is, in the articles, they described him to the point where it was easy to determine exactly who they were referring to, because this guy, there's already a lot known about him because of what he's done in the past and because of how he's been involved in politics for a long time. So they described him and, what he did, like, he was a teacher at one point in somewhere overseas, and they mentioned that, and the people who are familiar with this were like, oh, I know who that is. That's Stefan Halper, however the fuck you say it. But why, and Glenn Greenwald points this out, why was the New York Times trying to hide his identity and the Washington Post trying to hide his identity? In other words, what's the actual national security concern that you're saying, we can't release this information because of national security? Because it appears like what's happening here is what happens all the fucking time, which is whenever the government doesn't want you to know something, they will just lie and say, this is to protect national security. But that doesn't mean it's actually to protect national security. It just means they don't want you to know. So they didn't say his name, but they gave enough information so that people figured out who he was. Well, why are they saying this is national security? That makes no sense. There's no real, threat to national security if you release his name. And also, what the fuck was going on? Why was this guy infiltrating the Trump campaign? Well, there are some chilling parts of the article that I want to talk about. Here's the first one. So Greenwald says, but it now seems clear that Halper's attempts to gather information for the FBI began before that, meaning before Papadopoulos, who was part of Trump's campaign, gave the drunken ramblings and he mentioned Russia, which people say that's what led to the Russia investigation, to looking into the Trump campaign. But Greenwald says, no, it appears that it now seems clear that Halper's attempts to gather information for the FBI began before that. The professor's interactions with Trump advisors began a few weeks before the opening of the investigation, when Page met the professor at the British Symposium, the Post reported. While it's not rare for the FBI to gather information before formally opening an investigation, Halper's earlier snooping does call into question the accuracy of the New York Times claim that it was the drunken Papadopoulos ramblings that first prompted the FBI's interest in these possible connections, and it suggests that CIA operatives, apparently working with at least some factions within the FBI, were trying to gather information about the Trump campaign earlier than had been previously reported. So the idea is, this guy, now he works for the CIA, but historically he did work for the CIA. Now he works for the FBI, but historically he worked for the CIA. So you have a CIA guy who's in the FBI who's spying on the Trump campaign. and did it before there was any evidence of any wrongdoing. And look at this part. Whatever else is true, the CIA operative and FBI informant used to gather information on the Trump campaign and the 2016 campaign has, for weeks, been falsely depicted as a sensitive intelligence asset rather than what he actually is. A longtime CIA operative with extensive links to the Bush family, who was responsible for a dirty and likely illegal spying operation in the 1980 presidential election. For that reason, it's easy to understand why many people in Washington were so desperate to conceal his identity. But that desperation had nothing to do with the lofty and noble concerns for national security they claimed were motivating them. Okay, so let me explain what this really means. Now, everybody, let me just be clear up front. Everybody knows I'm no fan of Trump. I despise Trump with a burning passion. And if you don't believe me on that, go ahead and type Trump into the Secular Talk search box, and you'll find that, 98% of the coverage of him is negative? Now, it's not negative because of some sort of bias I have against Trump. It's negative because the policies he's pursuing are actively against the interests of the American people. So I think I have my anti-Trump bona fides. Is that the word? Bona fides? Bona fides? Whatever the fuck it is. I have my anti-Trump credentials, and if you question them, you're a silly person. Okay, now putting that aside. What it looks like happened here, a former CIA operative, who, by the way, in the 1980 campaign, what he did is he infiltrated Jimmy Carter's campaign. Whenever they would have discussions about policies, whether it be foreign policy, whether it be domestic policy, this guy would leak that information to the Republicans. And so the Republicans were playing chess, but they were cheating, basically, and they knew everything about Jimmy Carter and what step he was going to make in his campaign and what the Democrats were doing. So it was probably illegal. It was a spying operation to look at the person who they disagreed with politically to try to cheat to defeat them. That's what that was. That's who this guy is. He was a CIA operative who did that. Then went from working at the CIA to the FBI, close ties to the Bush family and the CIA still, infiltrated the Trump campaign before any sign of wrongdoing. So let's just call this what it is. The deep state, CIA, FBI, people who are for their careers in Washington, D.C., and who really run shit, along with, corporations, they were infiltrating campaigns that they thought might rock the boat. And this is an attempt for the deep state to interfere in elections to affect the outcome. Because what this guy was doing was taking that information and sharing it. By the way, who is he sharing it with? You have close ties to the Bush family. Okay. Well, the Bush family really didn't hide it much. They supported Hillary Clinton. H.W. came out and said it. W, I don't know if he said it, but he certainly didn't come out and say he supported Trump. Now, there are many CIA operatives and FBI guys and all, like the deep state, they did support Hillary Clinton in this election. Michael Morell's a good example. Countless quotes. Greenwald lays them out in the article of all the people who supported Hillary Clinton. So what we might have here, and why they were trying to conceal this guy's identity is, if you learn his identity, people who connect the dots will find out, oh shit, this is the CIA/the FBI infiltrating Trump's campaign early on to do an illegal spying operation because he seems like a candidate who might rock the boat and threaten the establishment. By the way, it turns out he didn't do any of that. He's doing their bidding. But, they can now take this information and slip it to both establishment Republicans, but also Hillary Clinton. So, as a final point on this, a little cherry on top for you to really grasp the scope of this problem. If they did this with Donald Trump's campaign, what do you think was going on with Bernie Sanders' campaign? That's why this is fucked up. Because you want to talk about meddling in elections. Our own deep state is meddling in elections. Now, I just told you I'm no fan of Trump. But here's what shouldn't be happening. For political reasons, the deep state, the CIA, the FBI, infiltrating campaigns, spying on them, and giving information to the deep state and the establishment. That's what's happening. And I have zero doubt. They were doing this with Trump. They were doing it at least the same, probably more, with Bernie Sanders. Because if there's anybody, they thought Trump was a threat to the establishment. He wasn't. He's doing their bidding. But Bernie Sanders is a real threat to the establishment. So why wouldn't you have the deep state infiltrate him illegally, spy on him, get the information, and give it to his political opponents, the establishment? That's exactly what's happening. So if you're against meddling in elections, if you're somebody who's so concerned about the Russia stuff, you should be the loudest voices against this, because this really, really, really is meddling in our elections by the CIA and the deep state, affecting the outcome, and it shouldn't be allowed. It's probably illegal, and it's definitely unethical and wrong.